O YouTube ainda não atualizou, tá? Com uma foto do lado.
Olá, pessoal. Boa noite. Eu sou o Ian História, presidente do Clube Farroupilha. E bem-vindos ao primeiro SIF Talks, um evento gratuito promovido pelo Clube Farroupilha para disseminar o conhecimento sobre conceitos liberais da economia, filosofia e direito. Esse evento, assim como todos os nossos outros, só é possível graças aos nossos apoiadores e patrocinadores, em especial a Mutual, a Vulcan Investimentos, a Atlas Network, o Instituto Mises Brasil e o Students for Liberty Brasil. Lembrando que também estão abertas as inscrições para o Simpósio Interdisciplinar Farroupilha 2020. O SIF vai ocorrer nos dias 6 e 7 de novembro e pela primeira vez vai ser completamente online. Mais informações no evento vocês podem ver na descrição aqui da live e também no evento, no site do evento, em sif.net.br. Nós teremos cupons de desconto para todos os que estão assistindo o SIF Talks hoje. Basta preencher o formulário, que está com o link aqui na descrição, e vocês vão receber o cupom de desconto e as informações completas do SIF à medida que vão sendo divulgadas. Hoje, quem fala conosco é Leonard Read. Ele foi presidente do Mackinac Center for Public Policy, um dos maiores think tanks dos Estados Unidos, de 1987 até 2008, quando ele assumiu a presidência da Foundation for Economic Education, uma lendária instituição liberal fundada por Leonard Read e Henry Hazlitt, um dos maiores nomes do liberalismo mundial. O Sr. Read já foi palestrante do Simpósio Interdisciplinar Farroupilha em 2018, sendo uma das grandes falas daquele ano. E hoje ele vai falar um pouquinho sobre livre mercado em comparação ao protecionismo. Please, Mr. Read.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you to the members of Clube Farroupilha. My Portuguese isn't very good, so I may have slightly mispronounced that, but I am so happy to be back with you. I have great memories of my visit to Santa Maria 2 years ago, and I appreciate your having me back. Today, I have been invited to talk about free trade versus protectionism, which is really the opposite of free trade. And what I would like to accomplish in this talk is to provide you the basic building blocks of the case for free trade. So as Ian mentioned, I know in his introduction, and I will reinforce, I am a believer in free trade. The freer, the better, with few exceptions. And whenever I can be convinced to make an exception, it really is an extraordinary event or extraordinary occasion. This is something that there is great consensus among economists about. Economists differ on a lot of things, but when it comes to trade, there are very few economists out there who want less of it, or even fewer who think that trade itself as a principle is a bad idea. In fact, if you were to argue that trade is itself not a good thing, I would question whether or not you're really an economist, because without trade, of course, there is no economy. So let me begin with the most basic building block so that all of you who are listening can come away from this lecture with an idea of why do economists agree, for the most part, on the virtues of trade. The first of these building blocks is something that we call the law of association. The law of association. And that essentially says that people benefit from cooperation. People benefit from cooperation. In other words, we are social beings. We have so much more to be gained by finding ways to work together, to collaborate, and yes, engage in trade with each other. We have so much more to be gained by these things than by, say, ignoring each other or attacking each other. Any benefits from that are short-term at best. So if you want humanity as a whole to progress economically, you should be, I think, in favor of encouraging more economic cooperation. And that takes the form, of course, of commerce, exchange, or trade. So people benefit from cooperation. That's the law of association. Now, you might think, well, that is so basic. Everybody knows that. But then just look around the world. Does everybody practice the law of association? I don't think so. All over the world, you have people who are erecting roadblocks to peaceful commerce, who are making war against others, and who in one way or another are flouting the law of association. They're trying to raise barriers to cooperation rather than bring them down. So we have a lot yet to learn about the virtue of the law of association, or at least many people do. Now, when people understand and begin to find ways to practice what they're preaching about the law of association, when they realize how important it is to find ways to peacefully collaborate, well, then some remarkable things begin to happen. The very next thing is what economists call specialization. Specialization, another term for that is the division of labor. If you realize that it's important to collaborate and cooperate with someone else, well, then pretty quickly you're going to realize it doesn't make any sense for you to try to produce everything you want and need. You couldn't possibly do that anyway. Why try? It makes sense for you to find a few things, or maybe just one thing that you can do really well. Specialize in that, and then from the surpluses of that product or service that you're able to create, then you can engage in trade with other people who themselves have engaged in some kind of specialization, and as a result have something to offer you. So specialization is a very important element in the logic and the practice of free people in a free economy. It's a natural sort of thing. You don't need the king to order it. No dictator has to tell you to do it. It's something that happens on its own, and for very good reasons. The next building block that is in this train of blocks I want to talk about that stems directly from specialization is comparative advantage. Comparative advantage. Now, there are two kinds of advantages, at least in this context of trade, that economists often talk about. Comparative is one. The other is absolute. Absolute advantage means if you have that in something, that means nobody can make that item better or cheaper than you. You're just the best at it, period. We all have maybe here and there some absolute advantages in something, but most of us are not yet able to find anything that we can do perfectly. So there's always room for improvement. So as economists, we talk more frequently about the other kind of advantage, comparative advantage. And this is an advantage that relates to cost. It means that if you have a comparative advantage in something, it means that you are able to produce that something, that good or that service, at lower opportunity costs than other people. You may not be perfect at it, you're probably not, but you can produce it at lower opportunity costs. Now, I should explain what that is because it isn't completely understood well by everybody. When I was teaching economics years ago at the college level, I used to ask my students what the cost of a college education was. And immediately hands would go up in the air and they would give me exact figures. They would say, oh, well, it's the tuition that our parents are paying. And someone else would say, well, it's tuition plus the room and board that they're also writing out a check for. And most of the answers were in some way or another related to those two big items. The cost of a college education, the students told me, was pretty much tuition and room and board. Well, that gave me an opportunity to say, actually, that may only be the beginning of the cost of a college education as economists look at costs, because we think of cost as all of the foregone opportunities, all the things that you can't do, that you can't enjoy, that you no longer have or have access to because you made this or that particular expenditure. So when I explained cost that way, the students began to see, oh yeah, so there are other things involved, such as what would you be doing for 4 years or 6 years or 8 years, whatever it takes you to get through all your years of college, what would you be doing if you were not going to college? And most of the students realize, well, they would be working somewhere, earning some income, but they're not doing that because they're at college. So what the cost of college really is, when you consider all of the opportunity costs, it's room and board, it's tuition, and it's all the income you would have been earning but now are not because you're at college. That makes college a little more expensive than you might have thought. So back to comparative advantage, as I said, when people specialize in things, they tend to specialize along the lines of what they can produce at lowest opportunity cost. Let's say, for Americans, of course, we love bananas. And we get bananas, probably some from Brazil, but I think most of them come from Central America, say Honduras. I know that's a big banana producing country. We could grow bananas in New York City under glass, maybe even enough for the whole country. But why don't we do that? Maybe, even if we could assume for a moment that the bananas we might grow under glass in New York would be superior bananas, taste better, look better than the bananas from, say, Honduras. Even if we assume that for a moment, you pretty quickly realize we could not produce bananas in New York City under glass at a competitive cost. In terms of comparative advantage, even if our bananas would be better under glass, which I doubt, we would not have a comparative advantage over Honduras. That country has a comparative advantage in banana production over the US because of climate, maybe soil conditions, labor costs, any number of other factors. And so without anybody ordering it to happen, Americans are happy to get their bananas from places like Honduras. And we don't run around New York City complaining about all the unemployed banana workers who could have a job if only we produce bananas under glass in that city instead. Honduras has a comparative advantage. They can produce those bananas at lower opportunity cost. And I often provide this example too, involving a brain surgeon. Let's imagine a brain surgeon in your town who everybody says is the best brain surgeon in town. He has an absolute advantage in brain surgery. Nobody else in town can do it as well as he can. Now, the question is, well, will you find that brain surgeon also typing out his own billing, his own invoices to send to his patients? Well, let's assume, well, what if he's the best typist in town too? Let's say he has an absolute advantage in both things, both in brain surgery and in typing letters and invoices and billings. He's better than anybody at both things. Would he still produce his own typed invoices? Of course not. And why? Because he doesn't have a comparative advantage in those things. Other people do. Other people who maybe have no skills in brain surgery, but they're very good typists. May not be as good as the brain surgeon at typing, but it's still worth it to the brain surgeon to hire them. Because if he takes an hour or 2 hours every day just to do his own typing, that's an hour or two that he would be giving up of the very lucrative occupation of a brain surgeon. And so he is not a very good typist when it comes to comparative advantage and the relative costs of doing that. So as you might imagine, in free societies, when people are left alone, they begin to cooperate and they specialize. They tend to find things to do that they can produce at lower opportunity costs than others. And then what's the next building block? The principle of free exchange. The principle of free exchange. If you're not Robinson Crusoe on a deserted island all by yourself, trying to make everything you want and need all on your own, then you better learn to cooperate and to associate and to specialize and find what you can specialize in at lowest opportunity cost, and then engage in trade. And if you're on an island by yourself, of course, you can't do that, but you're going to have to hope that somebody is going to come along in a boat, and then you can suddenly improve your well-being by trading with that person. In real life, of course, we don't live on deserted islands by ourselves. And so we do engage in trade when we're left alone, and we do so because both sides to the trading transaction benefit. That's what the principle of free exchange essentially says. Both sides to a free trade benefit. If you're taking notes, I would urge you to underline the word free before the word trade. Both sides to a free trade benefit. I say underline that because it's important that the trade be voluntary, that it be free, that it be a matter of your choice. If you're compelled to make the trade, it's almost certain that at least one side of the transaction, maybe both, will not be better off. If you have to be coerced into making it, chances are, by your estimation, you're not going to be better off after the transaction than you would have been had it not been forced upon you. So this is true, this principle of free exchange, in the smallest of trades, just as true as it is in the largest of trades and transactions. It's true of people regardless of what languages they speak or where they're from or what their religions may be. All of that is utterly irrelevant. We trade because we believe in our own subjective, subconscious, or very conscious thinking that we will be better off after we make the transaction. Now, of course, we sometimes make mistakes, right? I mean, you've bought things before that you later wish you hadn't. You might decide, oh, I forgot I had one of those already. Wish I hadn't made that trade. Or you might decide, oh, it doesn't do what I thought it was going to do. Or maybe in some cases, the seller cheated you in some way. He sold the good to you under conditions of fraud or deception. But those instances are few and far between compared to the vast, vast majority of transactions which leave both traders better off than before. And of course, how do we know that? Well, because if it didn't, they wouldn't have done it. That's why. It doesn't make any sense for the rest of us to stand apart from these other two people doing the trading and saying, oh, you shouldn't have done that. I wouldn't have done it. So why did you do it? That's irrelevant. From the standpoint of those who actually engaged in the trading, they were better off afterwards, or they wouldn't have done it in the first place. Now, I gave you some building blocks there of the free trade argument. And I want to pose a question that you can just think about. I just want to pose it rhetorically. And that is this: is there anything about any of those principles that I've talked about that is only peculiar to certain countries or certain languages or certain cultures? I don't think so. I think all of this applies no matter where you are, who you are, what language you speak, or whatever. I mean, I don't know of any of these rules or pillars or building blocks that don't have universal applicability all over the world. And yet there are people in the world who say, but we're different, or foreigners are different, and so we have to have some interventions to prevent this free trade stuff from happening. That brings me now to protectionism, which I want to start on with a definition. You might think, oh, protectionism, that's trade barriers. Yeah, it is. But I have a definition that I think is not only a little longer, but it's more complete. And it underscores the essence of protectionism right from the beginning. And it goes like this: protectionism is the use of force to intervene in other people's trades for someone else's benefit. Think about that. Protectionism is the use of force to interfere in other people's trades for someone else's benefit. Okay, one last time. Protectionism is the use of force to interfere in other people's trades for someone else's benefit. Now, if you are a protectionist, you might immediately say, oh, that's such a loaded definition. How could anybody be for it if that's what it is? But I'm going to defend it as exactly what protectionism is all about. First of all, the use of force. Now, protectionism isn't just a speech by a politician who says, oh, I don't think you should buy that. Please don't buy this. Don't buy it if it's made from that guy. It's not just speeches, it's the use of force. Okay, and of course, the principal means by which protectionism is implemented would be tariffs, taxes on imports from other places, tariffs. Then you also have quotas. They're a very important protectionist device, quotas, where the government says you can only bring in so much of this good in the course of a year and nothing beyond that. In some ways, quotas can be worse than tariffs, because think of it this way, at least with a tariff, if you want something and you really need it and you can find the money to pay for it, no matter how high the price might go because of the tariffs government imposes, you can still legally get it. You just have to figure out how you're going to pay that high price. But if the government says, sorry, the total amount of that good that we are allowing into the country this year has already been met, well then, no matter how badly you want it or how badly you need it, might even be a life-saving drug, if it's subject to a quota that's already been met, then you cannot legally get it. Doesn't matter how much money you have. So in that sense, depending on the situation you're in, that could be more deadly, more harmful than a tariff. So it's the use of force through tariffs and quotas and other inhibitions which government puts in place with penalties. It doesn't say just, please don't buy that stuff. It says, if you do, you're either going to pay more for it in the form of this tax, or if you buy too much of it or more than the quota has permitted, we will put you in jail or fine you. Okay, so it ultimately is the use of force. And to accomplish what? To intervene in other people's trades. Okay, this is the government coming in and saying, not to itself, it's saying to other people, hey, quit buying that, or we're going to change the conditions under which you're allowed to buy that. It's a third-party intervention in what two parties have already voluntarily agreed to, or would otherwise agree to, but now are not permitted to. So it's intervention by force into other people's trades, and for what purpose? To benefit someone else. Government, when it imposes tariffs and quotas, it never says, we're doing this for our good, meaning the government. No, they say, well, we're doing it to help an industry. We're going to put a tariff on Japanese cars, let's say, to help American car makers. And so that means that you as a consumer are going to be forced to pay more and have less choice, and maybe less innovation and improvement in the product, to benefit someone else, the manufacturer of cars. And I would not say, as a free trader, that tariffs and quotas don't help certain interests. I would say, yeah, just like a robber who robs a bank, that activity helps him, but it hurts everybody to whom the money belongs. And more broadly speaking, it probably hurts society at large, because to the extent that he might get away with it, it's only going to encourage more of that harmful activity. That's what protectionism is by definition, the use of force to intervene in trade for someone else's benefit. Now, does it make any sense? Clearly, what I've said so far would strongly suggest that it doesn't, but let's get into some specifics. I want to give you 3 categories of argument against protectionism, or let's say the tariff in particular. That's probably the most common protectionist device. Let's zero in on that with an example. 3 arguments, I should say, against the tariff. And since I used the example a moment ago of a tariff on Japanese cars, let's extend that a little further. Let's say the government says, whether it's in Brazil or the United States, it says, we don't want Japanese cars coming in here in so many numbers as they are. So let's put a $10,000 tariff on those cars coming into Brazil or the US from Japan, $10,000 per car, okay? Well, there are some real people harmed by that, okay? But the first argument that I want to raise is not even an economic one. The first big category of argument against the tariff is called the liberty argument. The liberty argument, okay? What do I mean by that? If you don't value liberty, this won't mean very much to you, but it basically says you have a right as a free person to engage in peaceful commerce. And if somebody else wants to come in and say, no, you don't, I want to take that away, I'm going to punish you for doing that, the burden of proof that they have such a right should be on them. Why do they have that right? Why don't you and I have it to impose on them? So that's the liberty argument, which, if you believe in liberty, should count for a lot. Tariffs and quotas and ever higher burdens imposed by government on the free interchange of international trade is a violation of individual liberty. We are less free, in other words, when we're forced by government, for whatever purpose, to pay an extra charge or have fewer products to be able to buy because they're from overseas. That's the liberty argument. Now, again, if you don't believe in liberty, that's going to sound like, oh, well, that's no big deal. Protectionism provides economic benefits, so they're more important than liberty. If you think that way, then I'll have to come back and give you another argument, and that's exactly what I'm going to do now. The second argument against the tariff is the peace argument. The peace argument, P-E-A-C-E. The best summary of the peace argument that I'm aware of came from the French economist Frédéric Bastiat more than a century and a half ago. He said, when goods don't cross frontiers, armies will. When goods don't cross frontiers, armies will. What's he saying? He's not saying that free trade is a guarantee that there'll be no wars. I would never say that, because wars happen for a lot of reasons. But I think Bastiat was saying, if you want to drastically reduce the tensions that often produce warfare between people, well, bring down the trade barriers, allow people to freely engage in commerce. Can you imagine in places like, say, the Middle East, which has been racked by many wars in the last 70, 80 years since the creation of the State of Israel. Can you imagine if all the trade barriers between all those countries in that region were just done away with? If the government said, okay, free trade, if you're an Israeli, you can make an investment free of charge. You have to take the risk, but there's no tax or barrier to making an investment in Cairo, in Egypt. And for you in Egypt, you can invest in Israel. And if all these countries could encourage free commerce like that, there would be a lot less conflict, because it would mean that people would be making friends. They would be making contracts with each other. There would be vested interests increasingly in the cause of peace. If I were a businessman in Damascus, Syria, who has just built a hotel in Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, or Israel, or in Jerusalem, Israel, then if I thought that my government was about to declare war on Israel, I would say, wait a minute, I don't want my investment blown up. Let's find a way to make this, guarantee a peaceful outcome here, so we can all be in a win-win situation. So raising barriers often works in the other direction. It causes tension between people. And many wars in history have been preceded by first a breakdown in international commerce between the eventual warring parties. So if you're interested in peace, think of trade as a great weapon on behalf of peace. It's an opportunity for people to put their bad feelings or hard feelings aside and look for ways to engage in mutually beneficial and peaceful commerce. But it's the third category of argument that in some ways is the most powerful. And that's the economic argument, okay? The economic argument. The reason I say it may be the most powerful is this is the basis by which protectionists argue their case. They don't argue that, we should have tariffs and quotas and other barriers so that we can do violence to people's liberty. We just don't like liberty. We need to repress people, so let's raise tariffs. They never say that. And they don't say, let's have tariffs so we can create tensions and maybe go to war. They don't argue that either. They wouldn't be very popular if that's the way they argued. Instead, they say, oh, but we need tariffs and quotas because they make economic sense. And they would say, if there's anything to the liberty and peace thing, well, we're only going to take a little bit of your liberty by imposing tariffs. We're not going to take all of it away, so it's no big deal. Or they might say, we're not going to necessarily cause a war because we have diplomats, and any tensions that arise because of trade barriers, they'll work it out. Well, I don't know if I'd want to put my faith in politicians and their appointees. I don't think that those guarantees are nearly as strong as the actual bonds that people get from peaceful exchange. What are the economic arguments against the tariff? Well, let's get specific. The best way, I think, to present this, the economic argument, is to break down just who it is who would be harmed by the imposition of that tariff that we talked about, that $10,000 on a Japanese car. Let's say the government tonight imposed that tariff. Well, the first group you should think of course, as being harmed would be consumers. Consumers are harmed, obviously. If they still want to buy a Japanese car, they're now going to find it to be $10,000 more expensive. Well, then the protectionists might say, well, but they'll just buy an American or Brazilian car. They'll buy a domestically made car, so they won't be affected by the tariff. But that's short-sighted, because when you reduce a significant degree of competition, wherever it comes from, in this case from a foreign provider, you're going to reduce the incentive to keep prices down. You're going to reduce the incentive to improve the quality of the product. The domestic industry is going to say, hallelujah, we're going to benefit from this tariff on our foreign competition. And now we don't have to work as hard to serve the customer because he's got a lot less choice than he had before the tariff. So consumers are hurt, whether they are consumers of the foreign car that's tariffed or domestically made cars. The next group that is harmed would be exporters. Now you might say, what? I thought tariffs were impositions on imports. How is an exporter hurt? Well, that's the case because trade is ultimately a two-way street. You can't close the door to imports without closing the door to exports. If you say to foreigners, okay, you can't sell here unless you pay us another $10,000 per car, they're going to have a lot less money after they've sold whatever they can in your market. And whenever they sell something to you, what do they typically do? They don't send a boat over to Brazil or America full of cars and then bring it back empty. They sell those goods and then they use their earnings to buy domestic goods. It could be soybeans, could be any number of things. And that's what they bring back home. Well, if they can't sell here, they can't buy here. And that's true even if their government doesn't retaliate against yours. And most of the time they do. Usually a high tariff causes the foreign government to say, okay, you did it first, we're going to do it to you. And so trade breaks down, everybody ends up being a loser. So don't forget the exporter in this whole equation. But then you have another group too, and that's everybody and anybody who has to pay more for a car, wherever it's made, after that tariff is imposed. Everybody who doesn't have that amount of money after they've bought that car, they're hurt, and so are all the businesses they might otherwise have been free to patronize. So if I got to pay $10,000 more for a car, I got to tell my wife, sorry, honey, we're not taking a vacation next year because we got to pay more for the car. No washer and dryer because we're going to have to make the old ones work a little longer because I just spent $10,000 more than I should have for that car. In other words, there's a ripple effect that so often is ignored in this whole equation. Well, I know I need to open it up to questions. Let me just end with one last observation about trade, because it comes up so often, and that concerns the so-called balance of trade. There are a lot of people who get upset about this. They say, oh, but look, there are more goods coming into our country than going out from a particular country. That's supposed to be a negative balance of trade. If Japan sells you more goods than you buy from Japan, then that's supposed to be a bad thing. The idea there is that you should somehow encourage a balance of trade surplus, where more goods leave your country than come in. Okay. How ridiculous, though. I mean, from the standpoint of people who are actually doing the trading that gives rise to whatever the balance of trade numbers may be, every trade is a benefit, or they wouldn't have done it in the first place. And if you really want a balance of trade surplus, well, then the biggest possible balance of trade surplus would be created by just taking all the goods that your country produces, put them all on a boat or a lot of boats, send them to Japan, and then don't let anything come back in. Just get rid of all your goods, take nothing in return, balance of trade surplus. But of course, we'd starve. So I have a balance of trade deficit personally with Walmart, with my grocery store. I buy a lot more from them than they buy from me. That's a balance of trade deficit I have with them, but they don't complain and I don't complain. And it would be silly for some third party to come in and try to regulate us so that the numbers end up being somehow different. With that, I'm going to stop here, turn it back over to Ian, who will then regulate the questions. Thanks, everybody, for listening, and I'll be happy to be helpful now in answering questions. Oh.
Thank you, Mr. Read. We have some questions that some people asked here. For start, which countries or which country do you think are taking the best way to have a free trade policy? Is that a kind of policy due to a popular revolution or a top-to-bottom movement?
In most cases, as I think about it off the top of my head, countries that have been free trade or relatively free trade have gone that way either because its leaders have been ideologically actually committed to free trade. Prime Minister Gladstone of Great Britain made Britain the freest of free trade nations over the years he was prime minister by reducing tariffs from some 1,200 down to just 12. And that was because he read Adam Smith, he read Frederick Bastiat, and there were lots of people in Britain at the time who said, yeah, free trade makes a difference. Why should we be paying taxes to get things that we prefer? But then other cases, such as Hong Kong traditionally, have been very free trade. Hong Kong for decades had no tariffs, whatever, because of necessity, because its leadership, beginning back in the 40s and 50s, decided, hey, we're just a rock. We don't have much in the way of resources here. If we want to prosper, we've got to make Hong Kong a trading nation. We've got to make it a place that people will want to invest in. Let's encourage trade, not raise barriers to it. And so that's what they did. And they became one of the richest enclaves on the planet, largely because of free trade.
And what about Brazil or even Latin America? Being that this region of the world, being that susceptible to populism and protectionism, as the stereotypes tell us, this region has a chance to have a freer trade economic policy, or we are just have to deal with eternal protectionism policy?
Well, I'm a believer in the power of ideas. So I don't think there's very much in the world that is cast in concrete or stone that you can't undo if you persuade enough people. So even if it seems difficult at the moment to make Latin America more interested in free trade, I certainly see that as a difficulty even in America these days. You can change that by becoming ever more persuasive and convincing people of the merits of free trade. And sometimes the free trade side isn't hard charging enough. We're not as compelling as we ought to be. We ought to be out there saying to people, why do you want to be a sucker for special interests and politicians? Why would you want to let them get away with taking your money and taking away your liberties so that they can get some benefit from it? You're not benefited by protectionism. You're simply denied some choice. You're denied opportunities for innovation. Your industries that seem to benefit become lazy and they raise their prices and you pay that cost. Don't sit back and take it. Change it and spread the word. So never be discouraged by what might seem to be, inevitable or unchangeable, because it can be changed, but you have to change people's thinking first.
Nice. And a friend of ours asked if he would like to know if Trump's administration, compared to previous ones, previous American presidents, when it comes to a free trade and protectionism, how it compares?
Trump's administration has been more protectionist than recent ones. I know that he's raised some issues that do need addressing, certain unfairnesses that other countries may have imposed, but in the process of responding to those things by protectionist devices, we're sort of cutting off our nose to spite our face. We're looking at only the potential benefit of changing that country's behavior and not looking at the potential downside or the costs in terms of higher prices for goods and more tension that could lead to conflicts. So there is always two sides to the imposition of a tariff, and you can't look at just the benefit that you think some industries will get from it. You have to look also at the other side, the industries that will be subsidized and become lazy and will raise the costs and all that means for the consumer and for competition in the marketplace. I know that Trump says constantly that he really does believe in free trade. He thinks that the way to get there, to get freer trade, is to beat up on some of our trading partners first to get them to change the error of their ways. And if in the end that turns out to be the case, that we end up with freer trade, I'll be the first to say, hey, that's great, but it would be an unusual outcome from a trade conflict. They usually spiral out of control, and time will tell if this one does fully or not.
Sure. Do you believe protectionism can be used as a populist weapon in the city's election in this year in Brazil, considering that a lot of national producers from Brazil have suffered a lot with the pandemic?
Yeah, protectionism is frequently sold in a populist way by people who would consider themselves populist, because they go out and they crusade saying, I'm for you. And if you're a worker in this particular industry that's had a difficult time facing foreign competition, I'm for you. Tariffs will help you. I'm a man of the people. I mean, they often argue that way. I think a free trade position has to be presented somewhat in a populist way too. We got to come back and say, but wait a minute, you're hurting people, and let's talk about who you're hurting, and then we can weigh in the balance whether your proposal really makes any sense. In Great Britain in the 1840s, the infamous corn laws against the importation of grain were repealed, and they were repealed largely because of a populist campaign against them. Ordinary people, not the vested interests who were benefiting from the tariffs, but the ordinary guy in the street joined the campaign to get rid of these tariffs so that things like bread could be acquired less expensively. And it didn't make any sense while the Irish were dying from a potato famine to prevent them from buying food from overseas, just to protect some local domestic agricultural interests. So populism can be used on both sides. And there is some merit to using it on the free trade side, because it really, protectionism really does hurt real people.
Interesting. And to end our conversation, unfortunately, a friend that we have in common asked you to tell us a bit about when you were in Cambodia.
Yes. Oh, yeah, that was a wonderful trip. That was in August of 1989, long time ago, but I remember it so well. That was just 10 years after the Khmer Rouge, the really radical, egalitarian, communist whack jobs, were in charge of Cambodia. And during the 3.5 years they were in power in the late 70s, they were responsible for the deaths of upwards of a quarter of the country's population of 8 million people. A terrible genocide, a terrible disaster. So here I was going to Cambodia 10 years after the Khmer Rouge were forced out. The Vietnamese were just completing their withdrawal from the country, and I fully expected the Stone Age. I thought Cambodia would still be, so unbelievably poverty-stricken. I was prepared for the worst. And by some measures, it was still, of course, one of the poorest countries in the world. But I was amazed at the life that I saw in markets that had only been recently allowed to operate. Farmers, only in the last year before the Vietnamese left, were finally allowed once again to grow what they wanted to, sell their produce at market prices. And so here I walked around Phnom Penh, the capital, and I saw these bustling markets of every conceivable agricultural good you can imagine. And I saw it as a tribute to what freedom can accomplish. I mean, it can take, even a little bit of freedom can take a country that's just experienced the Stone Age and improve its well-being dramatically. Just allow people the opportunity to engage in production, creativity, and commerce, and they start trading and they improve each other's well-being in the process. So I was very encouraged by what I saw, given what I knew had happened in Cambodia just a few years before. And I'll never forget, maybe the questioner is asking about one particular story that I've always enjoyed telling. I was entrusted with some envelopes with letters and money to take to families in Cambodia. These were from families who had left Cambodia, were living in the United States, who wanted me to get these envelopes with money and letters to their loved ones back home, because every time they sent anything, it would be opened and the money would be taken or just wouldn't get there. And I said, okay, I'll do my best. And I found all the families that I was looking for, except one, because they were far away. They were in Battambang, not in Phnom Penh, where I spent most of my time. And so I was instructed, though, don't come home with any of the money and letters. If you haven't found the families, at least give the money to somebody, some needy person, because they will be everywhere. And they were. The night before I left, I decided, okay, with this one envelope, I'm going to give it to this guy who had given me some rides on his bicycle, his cyclo, as they call them, during the week. He spoke a little bit of English. I just had a sense that he was a good man. He smiled readily. He was very friendly, very helpful. So I said to him, I said, here's an envelope with a letter for a family in Battambang, and it includes $200. Would you try to get this to that family in Battambang? And if you succeed, you can keep $50 of the $200. And I thought, well, that'd be a pretty strong incentive. That's about 6 months' income at that time in Cambodia. Well, then I left the country, and most people would think, he probably kept everything. You never heard anything. Well, then about 6 months later, the person who first passed on that letter called me to say, Larry, I just heard from the Cambodian family that you couldn't find and trusted that other man to get the money in the letter to. And they tell me in their letter, they're reading a letter that they got from their family back in Battambang, and it says, thank you for the $200. In other words, that man not only kept the 50 that I said he could keep, he gave it all to the family in need. And I've always thought to myself, you know, that man was poverty-stricken himself, but what a man of integrity and character. Oh my gosh. If I could ever meet him again, and if my life depended upon him in some way, I would gladly trust it to him, because he was honest, more than just honest, at a moment when if he hadn't been, nobody would have known the difference. So that's probably the singular best memory I have from that trip to Cambodia in 1989. Sorry to go on so long.
No problem. It was very interesting to listen, and as we see, freedom is actually very beautiful. Yeah. Also. Yeah. So, Mr. Read, thank you to be with us again. It was a great pleasure to receive you in our event. 2018 SIF was awesome, and to have you with us today, it was also. Thank you again, and we hope to see you again soon.
I do too. I hope to visit Santa Maria again, and Brazil maybe many times yet. It's one of my favorite countries. So thank you, Ian, and thanks to every member of your club, and thank you for all the things that you do for liberty.
Thank you, Mr. Read. Pessoal, esse foi o evento com o Leonard Read. Mais uma vez foi fantástico estar com ele. E muito obrigado por estar conosco até agora. Obrigado pelas perguntas. E lembrem-se, se inscrevendo no link aqui embaixo na descrição, vocês ainda podem fazer a inscrição para receber notícias do SIF e receber ainda um cupom de 20% de desconto no Simpósio Interdisciplinar Farroupilha 2020. Para quem sabe, para quem viu o Sr. Read palestrando em 2018, sabe o quão interessante pode ser um SIF e sabe o quanto pode mudar a nossa visão de mundo. Então, não esqueçam de fazer a sua inscrição. E, mais uma vez, eu gostaria de agradecer aos nossos patrocinadores que sempre tornaram os nossos eventos possíveis. A Mutual, a Vulcan Investimentos, a Atlas Network, o Instituto Mises Brasil, Students for Liberty Brasil e os nossos apoiadores. Muito obrigado por ficarem conosco até aqui, e uma boa noite a todos. Tchau, tchau, pessoal.